fun begins.
Of all the video game series that lived and died on the 7th generation of consoles, Prototype has to be one of the better ones. The perfect combination of three of the main heavy hitters when it came to video game concepts at the time. That being free running / parkour, an open world sandbox, as well as being one of the earliest examples of a game including a whole bunch of ridiculous superpowers. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, we'd had plenty of superhero and super-powered themed video games before this, and in fact I still get all fuzzy inside when I think back to playing Spider-Man on the PS1.
Yeah, just my luck.
But that genre was definitely elevated to a completely new level with the release of the 7th generation consoles, pulling off the kind of things that those previous generations could only dream of. With stuff like the Arkham series, Infamous 1 and 2, along with X-Men Origins Wolverine. In fact, one of the few older games that came close to this was Hulk Ultimate Destruction, which in a lot of ways felt like an earlier version of Prototype, even being made by the same devs, Radical Entertainment. But for its time, and even still really by today's standards, very few games can lay claim to being able to offer up such a vast and limitless sandbox for the player to just wreak absolute havoc in. It's also not that hard to see why this was so popular, considering it came out during the peak of edgy main characters in video games. In Prototype, you're playing as a guy named Alex Mercer, a 30-something-year-old who acts all dark and brooding, with his leather jacket and hoodie, claws for hands, and his smoking hot ex-girlfriend.
Karen Parker.
I thought you were dead.
I should be.
What a fucking loser.
It opens with a whole Castlevania Symphony of the Night thing, where it starts you out as this super powerful and very high level character, teasing you with all these abilities and powers during this awesome prologue, before then taking all of this cool stuff away from you as it flashes back 18 days before all of this stuff happened. At which point Alex wakes up in the morgue with amnesia, to then find himself in the middle of this pandemic that's affecting all of New York City. Turns out there's some kind of virus that's infecting the population, and the city's been sealed off from the outside world with the military brought in to control the situation.
It became clear to me that McMullen, Gentek's director of research, had linked us all together.
But if playing through Half-Life has taught me anything, then it's exactly what to expect in that instance.
Rescued at last, thank God.
Anyway, it turns out Alex has now got all these superhuman abilities thanks to the virus, able to shapeshift into anyone he chooses, but also able to grow blades, claws, and other nasty instruments out of his body, which then sets him out on this epic quest to try and discover the source of the virus, and uncover this larger, greater plot explaining how all of this has happened in the first place. Hunted constantly along the way by a Black Ops military group named Blackwatch.
You think you've won, Mercer? You don't even know what fucking game you're playing.
Who kind of see the guy as another variant to the virus that they've got to eradicate. And in other words, they're the reason why you're fighting back against so many soldiers. Yeah, just this never-ending legion of masked, generic military bad guys that you can horrifically murder however you see fit. Along with all the various strains of mutants and other creatures affected by the virus, with it all coming from a mysterious woman named Elizabeth Green.
The time for waiting is over.
Who walks around dressed in the kind of outfit that is absolutely the fetish of someone on the dev team.
I don't understand.
She's your typical agent of chaos, an evil kind of character who just wants to watch the world burn, with her backstory even going decades before the events in the game. So, with the help of Alex's sister Dana, they've got to try to find a solution to the virus, along with finding a way to stop both Elizabeth and Blackwatch. With Alex taking things so seriously throughout the story that I think if this guy even tried to smile, it'd make his lips bleed.
If you inject it and consume it, it should cure you.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Alright, so before I get too far into things, I do have to thank Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Surfshark is a VPN, short for Virtual Private Network, that allows you to virtually travel the world, privately browsing by encrypting your internet activity, along with blocking ads and, more importantly, blocking harmful malware. With over 3,200 servers in over 100 different locations, offering a different server for every need. There's no need to count devices either, because with Surfshark you can simply set up one account and then just use it on an unlimited amount of devices. And Surfshark doesn't collect your personal information, your online activity, or your whereabouts either. Now, I think most people would agree that the best thing about using a VPN is when you're using streaming services, due to it giving you a greater access to TV shows or movies you'd otherwise not be able to watch. Like if I want to watch Naruto on Netflix, for instance, I can't because for some reason that show isn't gracing those Australian servers. But then if I simply change my location to the UK or the US, well then there it is. But it's even just good for gaming, hiding your location, along with also making titles available in your region you wouldn't get otherwise. And hey, I mean, if you're still not convinced, well, then there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Overall, there's really just no reason to be using the internet in the current year without a VPN. So to get 4 months for free, be sure to click the link in the video description. And yeah, once again, thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Now, despite how old this game is, given that it's going on 15 years now, it still really holds up in terms of serving as an interactive and dynamic backdrop for the player. And although the island itself is flat, there is still a lot of verticality here with all the various skyscrapers and other buildings around the city. The animations and the overall aesthetic for the virus and the various effects also still hold up really well. Again, being another one of those classic examples of a good art style standing the test of time. But it's the vibe in this thing which hasn't aged a day. And Prototype is absolutely one of the all-time best examples of a game perfectly capturing the feeling of being in a city that is in complete disarray. I mean, I just can't think of any other game that effortlessly captures the feeling of what it would be like in a major metropolis if things truly ever got this bad. You got people screaming and running for their lives, there's buildings and cars on fire, there's bodies piling up in the streets, and then the military driving around trying to keep some semblance of control, which, you know, equates to them just blowing things up with a tank. It's kind of like the opening scene from that Dawn of the Dead remake, only stretched out into an entire game. And as far as societal collapses in video games go, this is hands down one of the all-time best. The only other game I can think of that had this much chaos going on when it comes to like NPC activity was State of Emergency back on the Xbox and the PlayStation 2. But even then, like, all the areas in that game were a lot smaller. I mean, that was set in shopping malls and cordoned off streets made up of like a block or two. Prototype manages to pull this off within an entire city, and yeah, one based off New York of all things. And what's even cooler is that the further you get into the story, the worse things become, with that infection rate steadily climbing day by day.
Everything was getting worse. There were outbreaks across the city.
Now, the biggest comparison and criticism Prototype had at the time was everyone comparing it to Infamous, which is fair enough considering that game came out mere weeks before Prototype did. The main thing they have in common is that they take place in a sprawling metropolis in the middle of a disastrous event, with the playable character being pivotal to everything going on. But outside of that, they're really both doing completely different things. I mean, Infamous is more or less a third-person shooter, whereas Prototype's combat is almost entirely melee-focused, combined with those other moments when you hop into vehicles or pick up weapons. Traversal in Infamous is mostly just jumping up the side of buildings, mashing the X button over and over like it owes you money, whereas obviously in Prototype it's a lot more fluid. And even by the end of Infamous, when you've maxed out all the skills, Cole's movement options really can't hold a candle to Mercer's. The biggest shortcoming Prototype has is the whole morality system, or the lack thereof, which is something that was the cornerstone, not to mention the entire premise of Infamous, you know, in case the title wasn't evidence enough. This is where your actions in the story and the moment-to-moment gameplay really affected what kind of experience you were going to get. If you're going to help all the citizens of the city and put their needs before your own, then it would change the outcome accordingly, with certain powers even being locked behind reaching certain standings. In Prototype though, like, none of that stuff really matters. I mean, you're not really a bad guy per se, but even though you can go around killing civilians if you want to, it just never deals with the ramifications of all of this collateral damage. Just kind of like the game treats it as an unavoidable byproduct of being this unhinged bioweapon in a city populated with millions of people. It's like, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of damage and people are gonna die. Shit happens.
Hey, you know, shit happens.
It does kind of at times seem like maybe they were going to take that route though. I mean, there's a side activity here where you can destroy military bases and infected hives, and it could have been the perfect way to work in an alignment system. Letting the player decide if they wanted to help the military get things under control or assist the infection in spreading, propagating their own personal decline into becoming a villain. Instead though, you just destroy both of these things indiscriminately, with the only result being a bunch of experience points. The other thing is, the story in Prototype really does have nothing on Infamous. I mean, that twist you get later in the game when you find out who Kessler is, for instance, is just the stuff of legend.
It's not true. That's impossible!
And I will say too, that by the end of Infamous, you pretty much feel like you're more or less a god, like a literal force of nature, able to call down giant lightning bolts from the sky to obliterate anything in your path. Whereas by the end of Prototype, you know, you're obviously very powerful, but it's like the game still finds a way to force feed you a slice of humble pie.
Oh, shit!
If there's one thing that Prototype absolutely nails though, it's just how much fun it is moving around the city. It's kind of like the Assassin's Creed games where you just hold down the run button and your character's going to more or less navigate over whatever's in their way. The cool thing about Mercer though is that this also works with entire buildings, letting the player full on sprint up the side of skyscrapers, able to then use that elevation to jump into the air and propel yourself forward. Not only does this look awesome, but it's also just a really effective way to traverse the city. And the more points you put into upgrading these abilities, the better this stuff gets, letting you even dash forward in midair and charge your jumps up for even more height. A lot of this stuff is really just an evolution of what Radical Entertainment did back with Hulk Ultimate Destruction. And in fact too, like a lot of the moves and just attacks in general really make Prototype feel like Ultimate Destruction 2.0. The controls and the button layout, for instance, are practically identical when it comes to sprinting around, jumping, and attacking. You got the whole mechanic of being able to pick up objects and throw them at attacking vehicles, as well as this elbow drop move more or less being carried over verbatim. However, it does differ quite a bit in some key ways, considering when you're playing as the Hulk, you were more limited to just using your fists. Whereas when you're playing as Alex, he's able to shift that infection around in his body to morph it into various shapes. And while you initially only start off with his bare hands and can only go around punching things, you'll soon unlock claws, as well as hammer fists, a giant blade for an arm, and then eventually even a whip. Trying to list all the various moves and combos for all these forms would be way too time consuming, not to mention boring. But in essence, the way that it works is that the fists and the claws are used for faster and more mobile strikes, whereas the blade and the hammer are for more slower, powerful attacks, being far more useful against things like the tanks. You can unlock a whole bunch of different combos for the fists, but I just never found these to be all that useful, and spamming attacks with those harder hitting forms just seemed to be far more lucrative. Even for the whip, which is really handy at killing people, I found this thing to be far more utilitarian, coming with the very handy benefit of letting you latch onto helicopters, which is something you're going to come up against by the goddamn dozen. Because yeah man, if there's one thing that this game likes, it's fucking attack choppers. And one of the most annoying mechanics in the game is when the military calls in a strike package.
Red Crown, Echo 1 Alpha, request strike team support, urgent.
Which just equates to 3 choppers coming out of nowhere that start firing on you, more or less forcing you into destroying them.
Still in the fight, we're still in it. Going down, repeat, going down.
Again too though, something they took out of Ultimate Destruction. Same thing as well when your health is maxed out and you go into critical mass mode, allowing you to use the all-powerful Devastator moves to clear out the surrounding area. I mean, Ultimate Destruction had the exact same mechanic, even again called Critical Mass Mode. And just like in that game, these are insanely awesome. With one of them having this effect where all of these massive sharp pylons pierce to the ground and skewer anything nearby. Whereas the other one kinda looks like Alex has turned into a drop bowl of spaghetti bolognese, firing out tendrils in every direction and again decimating everything in range. Keep in mind as well that I'm only really scratching the surface of the amount of stuff you can actually unlock and bugger around with. And even after I spent like a dozen hours playing the game, it still kind of feels like you're barely making a dent. Even just upgrading things like your sprint speed and your jump height really goes a long way into progressing how Alex feels and controls as a character. So overall, it's a fun little series of movesets to swap back and forth between in a fight, and it really makes you feel like a bit of a human Swiss Army knife. If that ain't enough, you can even pick up weapons dropped by all these deceased soldiers, like assault rifles, grenade launchers, and rocket launchers, the latter of which start to become essential, along with hijacking enemy tanks and choppers to liberate them from their owners, and give the military a taste of their own goddamn medicine. And I don't know, like maybe this had something to do with the popularity of GTA 4 at the time, or just that the developers thought they needed to include it. But quite a lot of Prototype's gameplay and missions seem to revolve around driving vehicles. And because it seems like every second or third mission has you hopping into one of these things and hauling ass. Though I do think this has one of the funniest details when you're driving around in a tank, where you can see the nearby cars kind of freaking out and trying to get out of your way. Which, yeah, you know, makes a lot of sense. I mean, if I was driving down the street in my Mazda and I saw a tank coming towards me, well, you can bet your bottom dollar I'd be getting the fuck out of the way. There is a point about a third or so into the campaign where, for story-related reasons, you lose all of your powers, but when you get all that stuff back, it's more or less just a free-for-all for the remainder of the campaign. Where from that point on, the sheer amount of carnage you can create, combined with just how gone to hell the city is, makes for some of the all-time best escapism you're likely to experience in gaming.
I'm back.
I'm back, baby!
The other element of the gameplay are all of those moments where Mercer is sneaking around disguised as a human, usually a soldier or a scientist, moving through military bases undetected as he searches for clues and other bits of information. And these moments are kind of like a combination of John Carpenter's The Thing and the T-1000 in Terminator 2, where you sneak up behind someone and then consume them, sort of like melting them into your own body before then taking on their appearance. What's kind of funny too is how you'll often do this very clearly inside someone else's eyeline, only it seems that everyone's apparently got terrible vision, because they can't see this happening despite you standing mere feet away. Consuming certain soldiers serves as a way to upgrade your effectiveness with ranged weapons. It'll often unlock short cinematics, which explains more of the plot, but then consuming someone is also the fastest way to regain your health. As well as that, when you're disguised as a soldier, it's the only time you can call in airstrikes, which sounds a lot cooler than it actually is. Because despite raining down supposed hellfire from above, these airstrikes may as well be dropping down candy floss. Finally, when you got every single soldier, tank, and chopper in the city coming after you, turning back into whatever your disguise is can be a fast and easy way to lose the heat. Which is something you will need to do quite a bit here, because this is a game where you really are the man of the hour, and enemies don't waste any time in trying to kill you. But I mean, like, let's be honest, the military is absolutely justified in trying to hunt Alex down and kill him. Because from their perspective, he's just going around causing untold damage to people and property willy-nilly, which he is. There's even a fun little stat you get at the end of a fight where it shows you how many people you killed and how much money you just cost the military during that scuffle, which can and often does end up in the billions.
Holy shit!
So yeah, like, it does make sense that everyone freaks out when they see you, making those disguises incredibly important. And you'll really need to spend a fair bit of time here upgrading all of Alex's abilities, or else the last third or so of that campaign is going to be a brutal experience. Off the back of that as well, you can tell that they didn't really know how to make the late game more challenging, outside of just throwing a bazillion enemies at the player at once. And the amount of hostiles you have to deal with later on here is just insanity. Honestly, I don't think any other game exists that has this many choppers, tanks, and rocket launcher wielding enemies to deal with, all of which of course have pinpoint accuracy, even able to shoot you out of the air at times. Despite you zipping all over the place like Sonic the Hedgehog in the middle of a meth binge. And again, like, the only other game I can think of that did the same thing was, you guessed it, Ultimate Destruction. But at least in that case, it kinda made sense. You know what I mean? Given you were playing as this nigh unkillable enormous green rage monster, who is just this big dumb target begging to be shot at. I mean, the Hulk is an 8 foot tall and 12 inches long titan, making him perfect for receiving countless ballistics to the face. Alex, on the other hand, is just supposed to be a normal, average-sized dude, mutations aside. And you'd assume that being so nimble would make him harder to hit, but yeah, I guess not. By far the worst thing about the combat, though, are the hunters, which are easily one of the most annoying enemy types in any video game I've ever played. Visually, they're kind of like a cross between the Hell Knights in Doom 3 and then the Lickers in the Resident Evil series. They're these super tough, infected creatures you encounter early on in the game, and then from that point on, you come across them far more frequently. And not only are they fast and agile, but they're also resistant to pretty much all of your attacks and combos. For instance, where the various shockwaves and ground slam moves are going to stun those regular enemies, they do more or less nothing to these guys. They've got this combo that they can almost like lock you into, hitting Alex like half a dozen or so times over and over and doing some pretty hefty damage. And to make it even worse, you're rarely just fighting one of them. It's usually like 2 or 3 at the same time. And in fact, the first time I played Prototype on my PS3 all those years ago, these things pissed me off so much to the point that I just stopped playing the game for months, before finally coming back to it after I'd cooled off, where right away they pissed me off all over again. And if you look up the Fun Police in the video game encyclopedia, these fucking assholes right here are the first thing you're gonna see. Another really annoying enemy type are the super soldiers, who I guess are guys decked out in powerful suits that can grab Alex and throw him around. And I found the best action against these guys was actually reaction, waiting for them to grab me and then quickly countering their moves, because trying to fight them head on just didn't seem to ever go well. And one of the biggest problems with the combat here when it comes to taking on these tougher enemies is that all of your more powerful moves need to be charged up first, by holding down the attack button or buttons or whatever it is for a couple of seconds before it then works. And this might sound fine, but when you consider you're constantly being attacked by tanks, choppers, not to mention a bunch of soldiers with missile launchers, that means you're going to constantly be getting interrupted before you can get these moves off. Even healing can be a frustrating process, and I've had countless times where I simply couldn't even get a heal off in time because the animation wasn't able to finish.
I think it's had a good job. Working on the flare. We'll drop down and put that on him. Bitch!
When it comes to hijacking vehicles under duress, it's the exact same thing. Where again, if you take any damage during any of this, which you often will, Alex is knocked off and the whole process resets. Oh yeah, and I find it kind of dumb as well how this guy who can pick up trucks, cars and air conditioning units, throwing them up into the stratosphere with insane velocity, seems to have trouble ripping the lid off a tank or the door off a chopper. Though I will say in the game's defense, that animation you get when hijacking choppers is kind of awesome. Kind of reminds me of that scene in Aliens when the Xenomorph gets onto the dropship. There are moments as well when hopping into vehicles is objectively easier than trying to kill everything on foot, especially late game when you start coming up against the tougher infected creatures. And this is something I don't think is entirely good either. Only because if you have to resort to using tanks and choppers to kill enemies in the same game where you're playing as a mutated freak who can grow humongous claws and blades from his arms, then something has gone very wrong. The thing is though, despite there being so many annoyances, it does eventually feel like you're given the means to counter this stuff. So as annoying as the tanks are, for instance, eventually with the hammer fists or the blade arm, you can more or less destroy these things in a few hits. Choppers are still a royal pain in the ass, but that whip lets you latch onto them from a distance, and then reel yourself in for a quick and easy hijack. And even dealing with the hunters, your tougher attacks like the hammer fist and the blade arm can again finish them off quickly enough that they're not as much of a nuisance. There's even an unlockable move that lets you grab onto these guys and slam them into the ground, and yeah, that's pretty awesome too. Like most other sandbox games as well, I feel that Prototype really just excels when you're going around and doing all of the side content, ignoring that main mission branch entirely. And truly as well, like the variety for all of this side stuff is actually quite impressive. Like running around the city as fast as possible, trying to consume NPCs in a time limit, destroying the infected or the military in different kinds of vehicles, through to just racing across buildings and hitting waypoints like you're playing Superman 64. There's even a benefit to doing this stuff as well, considering you're always rewarded with more experience points. So those moments when you're making your own fun usually redeem the moments during the story when the game's trying to do it for you.
Ali! Oh, shit!
One thing that can't be redeemed though are the boss fights, and this might be some of the sloppiest action I've ever seen, since I handed your mum a $10 bill and asked her to meet me at the back of the gas station. Now these fights might have been okay if they were one-on-one, but they've done that stupid old bullshit of also throwing a heap of other regular enemies into the mix as well, which just results in pure fucking pandemonium. And I don't know man, like maybe I'm getting old and a bit senile, but it would usually take me just a minute or so to process what the hell was even happening, before I could even think about formulating an actual strategy. Half the time I can't even lock onto the boss itself because of how many other threats are in the area. And I gotta say that I would be genuinely shocked if these were even play tested, because they're just a complete mess. Thankfully though, there's only a few of them all up, which is handy, because ripping a band-aid off your asshole is more fun than playing through this.
Sting a little?
But you know what, considering the boss fights in Infamous were also pretty crappy, at least that's something it's not going to lose points on. So overall, it's obviously a far from perfect game, but it still really does excel at what it sets out to do, which is just to be a loud, violent, and often mindless power fantasy. Coming out during that era where a lot of game devs were really in their element, unknowingly creating some of the all-time best bangers that the industry's ever had. Playing through it now again for this video on the PC of all things was also a really smooth and stable experience. You know, once I downloaded a patch so it launched in the first place.
I don't understand.
It reviewed and sold quite well apparently too, selling over 2 million copies worldwide. More than enough for them to justify making a sequel, which they did, and released in 2012. And I'll be honest, like I never actually played this one back in the day, simply because that first game never properly gelled with me at the time, so I didn't have any motivation to pick this one up. Going into it now, I had very little expectations, and I thought that I'd play it for like a few hours where it would fall into the same traps as the first game and then I could put a lid on it. But it instead ended up being incredibly fun to play through, just astounding me as to how much better it was almost across the board.
Well, now you know.
Set 1 year after the first game, you're playing as a US Marine named James Heller, who returns home from the war to find his wife and daughter have apparently been killed. Super pissed off and with nothing to lose, he heads to New York to help out in the fight against the virus, running into Alex Mercer from the first game, who's apparently behind the cause of a second outbreak. Instead of killing him though, Mercer claims to be innocent, purposefully injecting Heller with the same strain of the virus he's got, which in turn gives him powers of his own, in an effort to recruit James alongside him to bring down Gentek once and for all.
Now we're talking.
Or at least so he says, because as it turns out, that's all just complete bullshit.
All of it. It's in the plan.
Bullshit!
Because not only was Mercer behind that outbreak, but he's also recruiting and infected a whole bunch of other people as well, in an attempt to build an army of his own, with his grand plan being to wipe out all of humanity. Yeah, what an asshole. However, it is a story that works quite well, given that Mercer still looks like he's been designed by a 13-year-old edgelord, which really makes him perfect as a villain.
Not long now. Be ready.
Plus the backstory of Heller having lost his wife and daughter gives the guy motivation, not to mention justification for his anger and rage. Alongside that, it also helps that Heller is actually a likable character.
Oh shit. And I thought I had big balls.
With there being lots of clever and humorous little interaction throughout the campaign, a few of which had me giggling to myself like an imbecile.
I'm at the computer. What do I press? First, you need I'm pressing the red button. Shit. Now the screen's all fucked up. Shit's broken.
Okay, press the alternate key. ALT alternate.
Alt. There's no fucking alt. I got a fucking squiggly line key. I got a fucking key with a triangle on it. What the fuck kind of keyboard is this anyway?
Oh, James, calm down. There should be a ball with a blue square on it.
Okay, that's more like it.
I mean, like, don't get me wrong, it's still grim, dark, and edgy at the best of times.
Bullshit.
But there's definitely a sense here of this thing not taking itself quite as seriously as the first game did.
Shit, dude. Have you been working out? I eat a lot of protein.
As before, Prototype 2 does a great job at capturing the feeling of being in a society that's in complete disarray, or at least heading that way. This time the city is broken down into 3 main islands or zones, with the infection getting worse in each area. So the starting area is in the green zone and things are pretty calm here, with only some light military presence, but otherwise it seems that people are going about their daily lives as if nothing's all that wrong. When you get to the second island, there's a bit more activity, and it's now common to see the military driving past in trucks, as well as small groups of the infected often attacking people. But then finally in the third island, the red zone, is where shit has hit the fan and been flung in all directions, and things here are more or less completely hopeless, with the streets being full of the infected like it's the middle of an apocalypse, and the military laying waste to everything they come across. It's really like the 3 stages of what the infection would look like if it ever reached a major city, or kind of like the equivalent of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and then Day of the Dead. Visually too, it's a noticeable step up from the first game as well, with far more NPC activity going on now, making New York really feel like a bustling backdrop. And the gameplay is again a combination of traversal, stealth, and then combat. Now, traversal is still largely about running combined with jumping and gliding, but all of these now seem a lot quicker, improving overall navigation quite a bit. Also, the fact that the really tall buildings aren't introduced until the second and third zone, by the point when you've maxed out all your locomotion skills, means that getting up and over these buildings is a lot faster by that point. So you're not faced with these humongous Tower of Babylon-sized towers in the opening missions. The combat is vastly improved as well, with all the various combos from the first game pretty much being done away with, and replaced with a much more simpler and intuitive system. Instead of having to swap between all these various forms during combat, you can now bind 2 at once to both the X and the Y button, you know, depending on your needs. And to do heavy attacks now, you simply just hold a button down.
Damn, I'm a walking no-fly zone.
There's a couple of new tricks in here too, like the tendrils, which can ensnare enemies, making them unable to move. And the heavy attack for this thing creates a black hole that sucks everything nearby into it. A move which I used far too many times to count. But by far the best improvement with the combat is when it comes to fighting all of those tougher enemies, like the brawlers, which are more or less Prototype 2's version of the hunters. The reason for that is that you've now got an incredibly useful proper dodge move, which lets you jump over the back of an enemy during combat to attack them from behind. Also kind of locking you into combat with that one enemy so you don't lose track of them. And this is such an improvement over the first game, where it's just this mess of having things leaping at you from outside your field of view. Even when you've got like 3 of these assholes coming at you at once, it's still far easier to actually keep track of what's going on now. Plus too, it kind of feels a bit like the evasion move from the Arkham games, where Batman would do a similar technique to avoid taking a hit. And I mean, yeah, like if you're gonna steal from the best. Even some of the other moves feel like they've been lifted from similar titles. Like Hella's pounce move with the claws, for instance, is kind of similar to the one that Wolverine does in X-Men Origins.
What's the matter?
But yet also that spinning tornado move you do with the claw arms is very reminiscent of another move that Logan had in that game too. Plus, the pounce can also be done from air to easily grab an enemy and consume them for a health boost, removing that fumbling around you had to do in the first game when you tried to latch onto someone. But even the stuff that isn't necessarily new, like, it just feels better. The hammer fist, for instance, it's kind of like they combined the fist from the first game, but then also the ground spike you could do with the claw hands, as well as incorporating the dive bomb attack when you're dropping onto the enemy from high up.
Yes!
That's awesome!
And using these things is so much fun now that I'm kind of surprised it didn't get banned in Australia.
Yes!
Oh yeah, and I really like how it has its own unique finishing move, where Hela basically gives the enemy a shuriken. The fact as well that you're not just fighting the same looking hunters over and over also makes it feel far less generic, with there being different strains who all act differently. The only thing that's relatively unchanged is the disguise mechanic, which functions exactly the same. The only real difference I think is that you've now got the stealth option from the get-go. And overall, like, that's just the general feeling the gameplay's got in Prototype 2. Like, they've really tried to look at the best ways to streamline that abundance of mechanics from the first game.
Oh, it's nothing to fret over.
So the Devastator move makes a return, for instance, but there's now only one option, with it literally being a combination of the couple we got in Prototype 1, which means that it both shoots out the tendrils in all directions, as well as having the spikes protruding from the ground. This then has the benefit of freeing up a slot for a new special move. We can call in up to 3 hunters at once to attack enemies on your behalf.
Oh shit, Heller's still alive, and it's like he's controlling the infected.
And mechanics like that really never do get old.
Destroy them!
On top of that, instead of just getting a bunch of upgrade points at the end of a mission or from killing enemies and spending them with no real game plan, now you're instead leveling up after a certain amount of XP, and then choosing from one of 6 categories to put points into, which usually even upgrades multiple things at once. For instance, you don't need to upgrade your sprint speed, your air dash, or your jump height individually. Now they'll all be upgraded at the same time. And then to further upgrade your moves, like the claws or the hammer fists, you just need to find infected out in the environment and consume them to improve those abilities, which is a lot more fun than just dropping a bunch of arbitrary points on something in a static menu screen. For all the various improvements to everything else, you earn these through completing side missions and finding collectibles. Like if you find 4 black boxes in a section of the city, take out a few field op groups in the area, or head underground and wipe out a hive, you'll be rewarded with a mutation for Hela for various categories, which can do things like further increase your movement speed, your health, or one of the best ones in the game, which makes you invulnerable to small arms. And there is something so awesome about being able to walk around while everyone's shooting at you and it doing absolutely bugger all damage. I just appreciate how these collectibles aren't put in obnoxious or hard to find places. And the UI even gives you hints as to where these are in the city, making it possible to find them entirely on your own and through a bit of exploration. Dealing with the abundance of missile launchers, tanks and choppers was often the bane of that first game as well, and even this has been fixed in a bunch of ways too. Firstly, you can now just instantly destroy tanks and choppers with a specific upgrade. But you can also rip the missile launchers right off the top of those things and fire them right on back. Yeah, again, another mechanic they took from Ultimate Destruction. Or just like before, hijack them and assume control, which is not only a faster process now, but also a lot smoother, due to the controls for both the tank and chopper being a hell of a lot better. Tanks, for instance, still move around like they've got a whole lot of weight to them, but now they feel more like actual tanks, instead of a shopping trolley that's got a busted wheel. And then defensively, the shield is now bound to its own button, so you can pull this thing out whenever you need it, and if you time it right, it can even deflect missiles right back at its target.
That's good stuff.
Which completely alleviates the nuisance those vehicles and enemy types caused. Even just using the shield to parry the tougher enemies like the hunters and the super soldiers, I mean, it's such a simple inclusion, but it goes a long way in making those enemy types far more manageable. And you know, reminding you that this is supposed to be a power fantasy, which it is. And I feel like I say this in every second video, but I really can't remember the last time I had this much fun just playing through a video game from start to finish.
Drop the act, you lying sack of shit.
My metric on how fun a game is kind of based off how angry I get when I play it, along with how often my wife has to come in the room and tell me to shut up. But I played through almost the entirety of Prototype 2 without her even having to step foot anywhere near my office. In fact, most of the time she asked me what I was laughing at.
Okay, That's more like it.
Like the first game as well, the sequel was really easy to get running on my PC. Yeah, after I downloaded another readily available fan-made fix. And outside of a soft-locked mission early on, which forced me to set my frame rate to 30 to get past, the game was again stable pretty much the entire time, never crashing once. I do find it kind of wild how this game apparently undersold when it first launched, which ended up in the dev team having to face heavy layoffs and the third game apparently being cancelled. Because I would have loved to see what these guys could have come up with for that third game, or even better, what they could have done with the current generation of tech, which you just know would have been absolutely mind-blowing given the potential we got with current gaming engines. Still though, both of these games retain their title as some of the all-time best power fantasy experiences ever made. And going back and replaying them now, even though they're only a decade or so old, they really do feel like something from an entirely different era. There's just that understated simplicity to a game where you can nonchalantly go around melting mercenaries into your torso, along with elbow dropping onto military tanks and slicing people in half with an organic whip. And for all the time and money that modern devs spend trying to accomplish the same things, they still can't hold a candle to that unrestricted sense of freedom that an old PS3 and Xbox 360 title from back in 2009 and 2012 achieved.